Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Jean-Sébastien Vallée and Candace Blake-Amarante of Equitas, Canada's foremost human rights education organization. At Equitas, Jean-Sébastien serves as Director of Education, while Candace is the organization's Knowledge Manager. During this episode, Jean-Sébastien and Candace discuss the origins of their interest in human rights and human rights education, how their prior education and work experiences have shaped their work with Equitas, the importance of storytelling in helping young people learn about and take action in defense of human rights, current initiatives which Equitas is implementing to defend the rights of Indigenous peoples and to address the continuing problem of gender-based violence, and how Equitas has worked with partners from the Global South to develop a plan to decolonize its programs and practices. Well, it's a great pleasure to me speaking today with Jean-Sébastien Vallée and Candace Blake-Amarante of Equitas, the foremost human rights education organization in Canada. Thank you very much for being here, Jean-Sébastien and Candace.
Our pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us.
I'd like to begin by asking what inspired each of you to take an interest in human rights.
I think I'll start. Human rights have been very personal to me, and the fight against discrimination. When I was young, really young in high school, around the age of 12, 13, I really was a victim of bullying, and going to high school was really hard. And after this very, difficult period and years of studying and education, I really decided that I would defend human rights. I don't know how, and I didn't know how and what I would do is exactly. But I really felt that I really wanted to contribute to this field, and I wanted to support people who were excluded or felt they were discriminated against. And so I've worked in this field now for over 20 years. And that's what got me into this field, because I felt that, yes, I don't have all the solution, but I can support people. I'm a good listener. I'm respectful, determined, and I want to connect people. I want to find solution with them. And I feel that, knowing your rights and knowing the rights of others and knowing how to act upon discrimination, and when there's to find an issue to fight homophobia and injustice and racism, you need to do it. And so as a young, as a gay person, I really felt discriminated against in my early life. And I really felt that I wanted to contribute.
Go ahead, Candace.
Okay. Well, I became interested in human rights issues while I was doing my doctorate in political science. In my doctoral thesis, Choosing an International Legal Regime, How Much Justice Would You Trade for Peace? I looked at various legal regimes, including one based on human rights and the cosmopolitan model, to see how and whether it could create incentives for warring combatants to negotiate for peace in a civil war context. What instead inspired my interest in human rights education was different. That occurred when I started to write stories for children. And it was rather serendipitous. I was doing research for a children's story I was commissioned to write for the Shriners Hospitals for Children here in Canada, when I came across the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in particular Article 12, a child's right to participate in decisions that affect them, which is particularly relevant for children who are sick. So I became curious about the convention and wondered why it had not been taught to me throughout my schooling. And I noticed that there is a lacuna in the general instruction of children being aware of their rights. So from there, I felt the urge to help fill this gap by writing stories and plays for children to learn about their rights. And it was also through my children's creative work that I came across staff from Equitas.
Jean-Sébastien, you had some prior experience in developing educational programs. So what influence has that prior experience had in your work now?
Mm-hmm. My prior experience in education as a French teacher here in Quebec, I was teaching French with newcomers to Quebec and college students, and it showed me how to be practical and action-oriented, and it also gave me the strength, to continue the work in human rights education. Because I would see, the discussion that we would have in French classes and French language classes would be around social issues and political issues and human rights. And I was really passionate about how we could learn French in this instance through discussing social issues. And my experience showed me really how to really plan well, because human rights education is also about like being well planned and well organized also, and showed me that learning a language is like any other subject, like human rights education. It takes time. You need to put efforts into it. You need to critically think about what you're learning. You need to put into practice what you learn if you really want to integrate and learn what you've listened to, the knowledge that you acquired. So I think it's quite similar, and it's made me believe in myself as a facilitator and think that transformation is possible and learning is possible, so that we could do that also with human rights.
It's interesting you mentioned that you were a language teacher prior to your work in the human rights field. In our interview with Hugh Starkey, he was the same situation. He was a French teacher, and he saw the same opening to actually deal with issues in the study of language. So that's quite an interesting parallel. Now, Candace, you describe yourself as an artist researcher, which I think is fascinating. Can you talk to us about why you feel the arts are so powerful in human rights education, particularly the stories that you've been writing?
Well, I think it's important to make human rights accessible, especially children's rights accessible. If not, they're kind of abstract concepts that are just resting in, international legal instruments. And so the work that I try to do is to bring it down to earth and make children see it through their daily living and lived experiences. And as for why I think it's powerful, it's a powerful way of communicating with children or with all humans. I have to quote Tyrion Lannister. I just finished watching Game of Thrones, and one of the characters said something so beautiful about the power of art. He said that what unites people, he asks, armies, gold, flags, and he concluded stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. So for me, using any kind of art form to share your story is the key to uniting us, which I believe is the foundation of human rights. And I try to write a good story for children, and I've been doing so through a couple of plays, which I wrote one prior to the pandemic that commemorated the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child with a playwright who's based in Toronto. Her name is Chelsea Woolley, and that had a staged reading here in in Montreal, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it couldn't go to a full production, or it couldn't tour schools throughout the country as we'd hoped. So kids could become more familiar with their rights. So during the pandemic, it became pressing for me, for children to become aware of their rights, because they're disproportionately afflicted, because they are more vulnerable, especially those who are poor and subject to domestic violence. So I was wondering what's the best way to communicate children's rights in this moment. And so I started writing like crazy. I was in a bit of a frenzy, and I wrote 10 different stories that creatively interpreted a different right in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the project is called Adventures with Claire and Joni, Seekers of Rights. And I'm currently looking for publishers to get that out to kids and schools.
Well, that's true. I think that's a very important issue, because in my experience, too often the concept of educating about human rights is deemed to be too difficult for young people. But it really isn't.
No,
it's a matter of how you present it, and the story, and how you actually engage them.
Exactly.
So now this next question, I'd like each of you to respond to in sequence or together. You have a number of important current initiatives at Equitas, one of them dealing with Indigenous people's rights, another one with dealing with gender-based violence. So what have been some of the strategies you found to be effective? And are there sort of historic and or contemporary challenges that you've faced in trying to implement those strategies?
Yes, I'll answer that question, and then Candace will answer the next one. What I want to say is that, our best practices, our good practices are really based on what the partners we work with around the world implement. We work in collaboration. We co-construct all of our projects. So what I'm sharing right now comes from what the partners, from the great projects that we've implemented with them throughout the years. In one of our projects, I'll talk about gender-based violence first. In one of our project that was called Advancing Equality Through Human Rights Education, was implemented in Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal, Haiti, and Burkina Faso. We found that some of the strategies that really resonated were the fact that it's really important to include women-led organizations in the project, obviously, so that because they are at the heart of the fight and they know the issue. They know the services for survivors of gender-based violence, for example, or includes the same with LGBTQI organization, include them in this reflection in the projects to make sure that they're at the heart of the project. Another really important strategy is to create the space that is conducive for collaboration between civil society and elected official decision makers, duty bearers, to make sure that we can really open up this discussion and deconstruct maybe sometimes stereotypes and myth about gender-based violence that some of the decision makers might have, but even some of the CSOs that they might have about what decision makers think or what it is about. As part of one of our project, the Act Together for Inclusion Fund, that is a fund that Equitas is managing with Dignity Network of Canada, funded by Global Affairs Canada, that is geared towards LGBTQI community around the world. One of the strategies that we often use to reduce gender-based violence and homophobic violence is really what we said, to encourage collaboration between LGBTQI groups and civil society organization and the public institution. So for example, holding workshops that bring together leaders, feminist group, lawyers, police, hospital staff, so that they together develop strategies to combat violence. So because together, when you can, develop action plans to reduce violence and making these efforts to have concerted actions. One of the other important strategies is to make sure that the well-being of human rights educators and defenders are also at the heart of the initiative, because opening up these discussions can be really difficult. So we use, a very survivor based, approach, making sure that survivor-centered approach, that people feel comfortable, they can open up. It's really well thought of. It's not something that you can just do simply in a few minutes. It's really important to reflect on that. And I think it goes hand in hand with some of the challenges we face. You asked me about challenges. Bringing people together can be a challenge. You bring people who have different views, like police officers, decision makers, and civil society organization, human rights defenders, activists in the same room. This is a challenge. It can be a challenge. So you need to be well prepared. You need to prepare the different groups before they come together. That's one of the also lessons learned, but a challenge that you can face. And the fact that people, police and CSOs, they have preconceived ideas of what gender-based violence is. We talk about, oh, well, they had too much alcohol, or they was dressing this way, this is why they were a victim of violence. All of these stereotypes that we need to also discuss openly and break before we actually go into the details of that, of the subject. So this is one of the challenges that, we saw. One other challenge that emerged from our project was regarding the role of formal institution, in particular law enforcement, what role they should play in supporting survivors of gender-based violence. Because in many cases, many communities, many countries, the communities, they wanted to encourage survivors to report instances of violence to law enforcement officials. The goal here was really to hold, the perpetrators to account. And this practice can risk placing the survivors, also at risk. And if officials are not equipped to properly support the survivors, they may re-traumatize the survivor, even place them in a greater danger after reporting. So in the end, the project really supported the survivors of gender-based violence. They offer them many different paths to support them and left the decision-making about next steps to the survivor with the support of the organization through a survivor-centered approach, involving mapping what can be done, which local organizations are specialized in working with gender-based violence, what they can offer, the number of options for next steps involving, psychological support and all of that. So that was one of the challenges, but we found some strategies to overcome it. I wanted to briefly talk about, Indigenous people's rights. You had that aspect in your question. At Equitas, as I said, we always work with locally based organization, because we are not experts on all of these subjects. And we want to make sure that it starts with the people who are really affected or who are Indigenous. So we do work with some Indigenous groups to advance human rights, but one of the ways that we can, as an international organization at Equitas, at least to reflect on the Indigenous rights and Indigenous people's rights, is to recognize first that our office are located on unceded Indigenous territories, and to move into the reconciliation path in Canada, because we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada in 2015, was established to hold and to reflect on the consequences of residential schools in Canada, namely what the federal government and the church authorities did to Indigenous people. And it came out with 94 calls to action. And at Equitas, we commit to communicate that in our projects in Canada with the partners, to reflect on our own practice and to see how we can implement that. And also make sure that we always talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that was adopted by the United Nations, and that was also integrated into Canada's law in 2021. So that's one of the ways that we can integrate it. But we strive to collaborate with Indigenous groups in Canada and support them in their actions. That's one of the ways that we can advance Indigenous people's rights.
Candace, you want to add anything, or do you feel you want to move on and I'll go on to the next question? How do you feel?
Oh, we can move on. He pretty much covered it all. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
It's very clear from looking at the materials on your website that organization like Equitas has made a very strong commitment to deal with decolonizing its programs and practices based upon, a whole host of factors. So what was the impetus for this work, and how have you and partners from the Global South collaborated to realize these goals, particularly the ones you sort of set forth in your decolonizing initiative?
Okay. Well, part of Equitas's knowledge strategy these past couple of years has been to collectively contribute to the field of human rights education by reinforcing principles of decolonization, anti-racism, trauma-informed approach, participatory action research in our knowledge development approach. So as such, last year, we held an international learning event, acknowledging our past while embracing our future, which was a 5-day learning experience where representatives from women's organizations, human rights groups, leaders tied to the Equitas community from our Advancing Equality Through Human Rights Education project and other previous and current partners. They came from 14 different countries in the world and assembled here in Montreal, and we held in-depth discussions about decolonizing partnerships, among other things. In the learning module, Partner Up, Decolonizing Partnerships and Planning Next Steps, we aim to see if a common understanding of decolonization could be obtained. And we did this via a roundtable of people discussing decolonization from 4 different perspectives. So the first was from the NGOs in the Global South, NGOs in the Global North, academics, Felicia Tibbetts was among them, and human rights activists and defenders. We explored what decolonization means to each of them. The main commonality across these different perspectives to decolonize human rights education was the need for co-construction. And by this, we came to an understanding that co-construction is a process in and of itself that entails going into genuine partnership building grounded on mutual respect and acknowledgement of agency, on learning and relearning to dismantle previous unconscious prejudices, prioritizing the agency of local partners in project implementation. And we also saw that there was a need for individuals with privilege, especially those with colonial histories, to take initiatives in their own education, rather than relying on marginalized groups for guidance, as there's quite a bit of emotional labor and exhaustion experienced by marginalized groups in educational settings. We also, came to realize there's some practical difficulties in this, and it was systematic changes in financial procedures and donor requirements for greater flexibility and equity in partnerships and resource allocation. We realized it required challenging knowledge production from the Global North and to promote more equitable knowledge sharing processes. And ultimately, as one of our panelists, Yusri Mustafa, said it, I think he said it best when he observed, we co-construct to continue to build a global human rights community that transcends nationalistic and colonial histories. So based on these criteria, one such way we are co-constructing is via our new Power of Equality project, which will be implemented internationally and regionally in West and East Africa. Currently, we are co-constructing our flagship program, the International Human Rights Training Program that we've had for over 40 years with partners from Kenya, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Brazil, Sri Lanka, Senegal, and Haiti. And the program aims to empower human rights educators and defenders to promote and protect women's rights and gender equality. And the goal will be to achieve through the complete revision and implementation and evaluation of the training program. In addition, we're trying to update the program to better respond to emerging issues in human rights education. And we also want to integrate non-Western perspectives to amplify marginalized voices and challenges in power structures within human rights education.
Now, you're talking about a broad definition of education, as I always understand it. It's not simply the formal educational system. You're talking about non-formal education as well. Is that fair to say?
Yes, very much so. I mean, in fact, we're targeting participants who are not affiliated with the universities or organizations. We're challenging anybody who perceives themselves as an educator or a defender of human rights, whether it be a social media activist or some or youths who are trying to make a difference. So yeah, it's a very broad training that hopefully will address each participant's need to be a better educator and defender of human rights.
I think it's a challenge to try to bring together all those disparate groups, because many times I think we bring to the table the prior narratives that we have learned.
Yes.
And it seems to me that one of the things you're trying to do is to stand back and really engage in a substantive critique of those narratives. Is that fair?
It is fair. Yes, we are asking them to unlearn most of the time and relearn.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful idea. And one, I think that takes time. It's not going to happen right away. It's just going you can't undo 200 years of narrative overnight.
No, not at all. Right. No, it is a slow, long process, but we hope to continue to do so through our training programs, through our online programs in our Equitas community. So it's a journey that we hope to go on, to go with them. We're asking them to come on this journey with us, not for this one time, but through a process that we're envisioning.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program concludes our conversation with Jean-Sébastien Vallée and Candace Blake-Amarante of Equitas, Canada's foremost human rights education organization. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hinz, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.